In the year 334 BC, Alexander, the monarch of Macedonia, initiated one of history's most legendary military expeditions against the preeminent superpower of the era, the Persian Empire. At the age of merely 20, his ingenious and dauntless command secured him triumph in engagement after engagement. Over the course of a breathtaking 10-year crusade that carried him to the boundaries of the known world, he forged one of the most colossal dominions ever witnessed. Rarely has a single individual exerted such a profound influence on the trajectory of history. While the Persians branded him Alexander the Damned, the West immortalized him as Alexander the Great, ancient Greece. From approximately 500 BC, this rugged terrain became the stage for extraordinary advancements in art, philosophy, and warfare. Its two premier city-states were Athens, a naval titan where democracy and culture thrived, and Sparta, a severe militaristic society renowned for its terrifying infantry. In 480 BC, these rival cities united to repel an invasion by the massive Persian Empire. At the constricted pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek contingent led by 300 Spartans delayed the immense Persian host for 3 days before being surrounded and annihilated. Subsequently, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek navy vanquished the Persian fleet. However, they could not stop the Persians from torching the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis. The following year at Plataea, the Greeks secured a definitive victory on land, compelling the Persians to abort their invasion. The subsequent half-century marked the golden age of classical Greece. Yet, escalating friction between Athens, Sparta, and their respective alliances ultimately erupted into war, plunging the Greek world into decades of ruinous conflict. These internecine wars among the city-states persisted for nearly a century, leaving them depleted and exposed to a burgeoning power in the north. For generations, the cultured Greeks had regarded the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a primitive backwater, barely Greek at all. However, under King Philip II, Macedonia transformed into a devastating military machine. His most celebrated innovation was the deployment of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, double the length of a standard Greek spear, wielded by disciplined infantry fighting in a dense formation known as a phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's forces obliterated the combined armies of Thebes and Athens. Through diplomacy and brute force, Philip brought most of his neighbors under his control. Following this victory, he unified Greece within an alliance known as the Hellenic League, with himself as the supreme commander. Only Sparta refused to join. Philip began orchestrating a grand campaign, a pan-Hellenic crusade against the Persian Empire. Their ancient adversary was now a fading giant, its vast wealth ripe for seizure. Yet, on the brink of launching his invasion, Philip was murdered by his own bodyguard, a casualty of Macedonia's violent court intrigues. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, a brilliant and restless youth tutored by the philosopher Aristotle and already a seasoned commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand design to invade Persia, but first he had to solidify his authority as king. Domestically, he purged potential rivals and crushed insurrections in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. He made a brutal example of Thebes, utterly razing the ancient city and selling its populace into slavery. By the spring of 334 BC, prepared to commence the war against Persia, Alexander guided his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. This marked the beginning of one of history's most spectacular military odysseys. Alexander's force numbered approximately 40,000, recruited from across Greece. The infantry fell under the command of the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the vanguard stood 9,000 Macedonian Phalangites armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional warriors, expertly drilled, who fought in a phalanx formation 16 ranks deep. This dense block presented an impenetrable wall of spear points, virtually unstoppable from the front, yet rigid in maneuver and susceptible to attacks on its flanks or rear. To protect these vulnerable sides, 3,000 elite infantry, the Hyphasis or shield-bearers, armed with shorter spears, were deployed under the command of Parmenian's son, Nicanor. The second line comprised 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries fighting as hoplites, named for their large round shield, the hoplon, and wielding shorter 8-foot spears. The Agrianians served as the army's premier skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what is now southern Bulgaria, supported by other light troops from Thrace and Illyria, utilizing javelins, slings, and bows. The strike force of Alexander's army was the Companion Cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen armed with spears and swords, led by Philotas, another of Parmenian's sons. Alexander personally led the royal squadron. Additionally, there were 1,800 Thessalian cavalry commanded by Callus, 600 horsemen from other Greek regions led by Erigius, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia under Cassander. The vast Persian Empire was partitioned into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now menaced by Alexander's invasion, convened to determine their strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a capable Greek general in Persian employ, urged them to avoid direct combat with Alexander. Instead, he proposed a scorched earth tactic to burn crops and villages and retreat inland, predicting Alexander's army would soon succumb to starvation. It was sound counsel, but the satraps refused to devastate their own lands without a fight. They chose to confront Alexander at the river Granicus. The Persian army assembled behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, roughly 10,000 horsemen from across the empire, Medes, Hyrcanians, Bactrians, and Paphlagonians. Behind them in reserve stood the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries who fought for Persian gold, equipped as hoplites. The Persians, perhaps mistrusting these men in battle against fellow Greeks, kept them in the rear. Alexander, resolved to strike and annihilate this Persian force before it could withdraw, raced to the Granicus with his finest troops. On his left wing, he positioned the Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry under Parmenion. In the center stood the massed pikes of the Phalanx. On the right, Alexander himself took position with the Companion Cavalry, the elite Hypaspists, the Agrianian javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, was likely slightly outnumbered. Disregarding advice to wait for dawn to cross, he ordered an immediate assault. He dispatched a squadron of Companion Cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of Hypaspists and the Paeonian light horse. Alexander, exhorting his men to display their valor, then led his right wing across the water. Reaching the river's center, the Greeks faced a barrage of javelins and arrows from the Persian line. Those who attained the opposite bank were instantly charged by Persian cavalry. Alexander plunged into the heart of the melee. He struck where the mass of their cavalry and leaders were concentrated. A desperate struggle ensued around him, horse against horse, man against man. The Macedonians fought to drive the Persians from the bank, while the Persians sought to push them back into the water. Alexander's assault appeared reckless, yet he was buying time for the remainder of his army to cross, including the unstoppable Phalanx. Suddenly, Alexander found himself fighting for survival, charged by two Persian nobles. Reshaped rode at Alexander and landed a blow on his head with a sword, shearing off a piece of his helmet. The helmet absorbed the impact, and Alexander felled him with his lance. From behind, Spithridates raised his blade against the king, but Clytus the Black, anticipating the strike, severed his arm, sword, and all. By now, the Greek army had crossed the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's offensive meant the Persians' Greek mercenaries had not even engaged. Alexander, in a blood rage or perhaps viewing these Greeks as traitors, ignored their pleas for quarter. The mercenaries were encircled and slaughtered. Alexander had secured a monumental victory. Asia Minor was now open to him, yet the Persian Empire remained a land of immense resources and power. It was already mobilizing its vast reserves to confront him. To conquer this empire and claim his place in history, Alexander would next have to face Darius III, the King of Kings. As Alexander neared Sardis, the capital of the province of Lydia, its commanders surrendered without resistance. However, before advancing further, Alexander needed to neutralize Persian naval superiority. Persia possessed a formidable fleet with major bases across the eastern Mediterranean that could sever his supply lines to Greece. Rather than challenging the Persians at sea, Alexander opted to seize their nearest bases, the coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both mounted stiff resistance but fell by winter. In the spring of 333 BC, Alexander pressed on into Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he was presented with the fabled Gordian knot. Prophecy stated that whoever could unravel it would rule all of Asia. Alexander simply drew his sword and sliced it in two. Meanwhile, Memnon of Rhodes led Persian warships into the Aegean, capturing Chios and Lesbos. However, Memnon's sudden death from illness caused the offensive to collapse. 18 months had elapsed since Alexander's army entered the Persian Empire. Now, he led his men into Cilicia, poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. But then, the main Persian army, commanded by King Darius himself, appeared behind the Greek forces to the north. Darius intended to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered nearly 2-1. He cut off Alexander's only escape route by positioning his army on the coastal plain near Issus, a strip just 6 miles wide between the mountains and the sea. The narrow battlefield forced Alexander to fight, but prevented Darius from leveraging his massive numerical superiority. His army, estimated by some at up to 100,000, included the Immortals, 10,000 elite household troops. His best cavalry massed on his right near the sea, while his finest infantry, the Greek mercenary hoplites, held the center. Alexander deployed his army, again entrusting the left wing near the sea to Parmenion with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the center stood the Macedonian Phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right flank against the mountain slopes. Seeing the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion, he shifted his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce the left. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind the small river Pinarus, waiting for Alexander to move. He did not wait long. Alexander rallied his men, calling them by name, then led the charge at the head of his right wing. Once again, the velocity and shock of the Macedonian assault sent the enemy reeling. However, in the center, the Macedonian Phalanx was struggling. In its haste to keep pace with Alexander, its formation fractured. Engaged in fierce combat with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the Phalanx was slowly being pushed back. Alexander, recognizing the peril, regrouped and led the companions in a direct charge at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries, threatened on their flank, fell into disarray, allowing the Phalanx to resume its push. Alexander fought his way toward the great king himself. Rather than face this seemingly unstoppable Macedonian, Darius fled the field in his chariot. Meanwhile, the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate fight against the best of the Persian cavalry. A breakthrough here could have allowed the Persians to envelop Alexander's army and snatch victory. But Parmenion and his troops held firm. As news of Darius's flight spread, the Persian forces abandoned the fight. The battle devolved into a rout. The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander. Ancient sources claim he lost only a few hundred men, while the Persians lost thousands. Alexander had broken Darius's great army, and the road to Babylon lay open. Yet Alexander turned his attention to subduing the western territories. In 332 BC, the coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted, ending Persian naval dominance. However, the island city of Tyre resisted. Its defenders fought with skill and bravery, even as Alexander constructed a causeway to the island, shielded by massive siege towers. But after 7 months, the walls were breached and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved, and Gaza also fell to a siege. Alexander continued to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor surrendered Egypt and the royal treasury. At Memphis, priests hailed Alexander as a liberator and crowned him pharaoh. At the Nile's mouth, he founded Alexandria, then traveled to the Oracle of Siwa, where priests reportedly greeted him as the son of Amun, king of the gods. Alexander returned east to Tyre in 331 BC, where he learned of trouble at home. Despite his victories, many Greeks viewed Alexander as a tyrant. King Agis of Sparta, backed by Persian gold, launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's regent in Greece, marched south and met Agis in battle near Megalopolis. The Spartans were crushed and Agis fell. With Greece secure, Alexander advanced toward the Persian heartlands for a final reckoning. He received a letter from Darius offering a fortune in gold, his daughter's hand, and half the empire for peace. Alexander rejected the offer. He did not want half the empire. He intended to take it all. In 331 BC, Alexander marched east into Mesopotamia. He learned that Darius had amassed a vast army at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul. Alexander headed straight for it. This was Darius's last chance to stop him. Darius had chosen a vast plain for the battle, clearing the terrain to facilitate his chariots and cavalry. Modern estimates placed the Persian force between 50 and 80,000. Alexander's army was smaller, possibly outnumbered 2 to 1. He deployed his units in their standard formation. Parmenion on the left, the Phalanx in the center, and himself with the companions on the right. Greek hoplites formed a second line to prevent encirclement. The battle commenced when Alexander moved his wing to the right, a maneuver that surprised the Persians. Attempting to flank him, the Persians mirrored his movement, thinning their center. Alexander's move was a trap to lure the Persians into weakening their line. Seeing it succeed, he ordered his Greek cavalry to charge, pinning the Persians in place. A massive cavalry engagement erupted. Darius then unleashed his chariots. However, Agrianian javelin throwers decimated the horses and crews, while the infantry opened lanes to let the chariots pass harmlessly through. Now, Alexander led his Companion Cavalry and parts of the Phalanx in a wedge directly at the weakened Persian center, fighting toward Darius. The ferocity of the attack panicked the Persians, and the center collapsed. Darius fled once more. However, Alexander's left wing was in crisis. Parmenion was nearly surrounded. Indian and Scythian horsemen had even punched through the Greek line to loot the baggage train. Parmenion sent a desperate plea for help. Alexander abandoned his pursuit of Darius, regrouped, and charged the Persian right wing. It was the bloodiest phase of the battle, claiming 60 of Alexander's companions. Finally, as news of Darius's flight spread, the remaining Persians fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a total victory. Alexander had shattered Darius's army. He entered Babylon in triumph, recognized as its rightful ruler. He did the same at Susa, taking the Persian throne. In the Zagros Mountains at the Persian gates, a brave Persian force held him up for a month until the Greeks found a path to encircle them. In early 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital. To appear as a liberator, he burned the city. Retribution for the Persian burning of Athens long ago. Alexander then headed north into Media, where Darius had taken refuge. Determined to capture him, Alexander pursued the fugitive king east. However, Darius was murdered by Bessus, one of his own governors, who then proclaimed himself king. Alexander ordered a royal burial for Darius, then paused to organize his vast new empire. He appointed viceroys, retaining loyal Persians in their posts. He then resumed his march east to kill the usurper Bessus and subjugate the eastern provinces. Crossing the Hindu Kush into the Indus Valley, his army advanced in 2 columns, winning skirmishes in what is now the Swat Valley. After a fierce siege, he took Massaga. The ruler of Taxila allied with him, and together they marched to face Porus at the Battle of the Hyphasis. It was Alexander's most costly victory, as Porus's war elephants inflicted heavy casualties. Yet, he won control of the Punjab. Alexander wished to push on to the great river at the edge of the world, but at the river Hyphasis, his army mutinied. Exhausted by years of war and thousands of miles from home, they refused to go further. Furious, Alexander was forced to turn back. He followed the rivers to the sea, a 10-month journey during which he was nearly killed assaulting a Malian city. Reaching the coast, part of the army sailed back to Persia, exploring unknown waters. Alexander led the rest through the Gedrosian desert, where extreme heat and starvation caused terrible losses. Back in Persia, Alexander executed corrupt governors and arranged a mass marriage at Susa to unite Macedonian and Persian nobility. He married 2 Persian princesses himself. He paid his soldiers' debts and drafted 30,000 local youths into his army. At Opis, his troops mutinied again, resentful of his adoption of Persian customs. Alexander executed the ringleaders and eventually reconciled with his men. At Ecbatana, his closest friend Hephaestion died of fever, leaving Alexander devastated. In 323 BC, back in Babylon, Alexander planned new campaigns into Arabia, but he suddenly fell ill with a fever and died days later, aged 32. The cause, malaria, typhoid, or poison, remains a mystery. He died undefeated. His decade of conquest created a massive empire stretching from Greece to Pakistan. However, it was unstable, held together by his sheer will. He left no succession plan, and his generals immediately fought for control, tearing the empire apart. His widow Roxana and son were murdered. His gold sarcophagus was hijacked. Yet his legacy ushered in the Hellenistic era, fusing Greek and local cultures and changing the world forever.